At this stage, the situation around Greenland and the trade conflict between the United States and Europe unexpectedly entered a phase of temporary de-escalation, which for many observers became a signal that Washington had been forced to adjust its course. Donald Trump officially abandoned the introduction of new tariffs against European countries and announced a suspension of any steps related to a possible invasion or force-based pressure around Greenland, referring to some kind of deal whose details have not yet been disclosed. Formally, this looks like a gesture of goodwill and a return to diplomacy. However, according to sources familiar with behind-the-scenes negotiations, the real picture turned out to be significantly harsher than what was presented publicly. As participants in meetings on the sidelines of the Davos Forum, where Trump spoke the day before, report, the European side took an extremely clear and uncompromising position. Europe made it clear that the issue of Greenland is an absolute red line, crossing which would be regarded not as a dispute within the alliance, but as aggression against the entire Western world. At the same time, according to sources, Europeans were ready for serious concessions in other areas. The expansion of the American military presence within NATO, the deployment of additional bases, the strengthening of U.S. logistics and defense infrastructure on European territory, as well as deeper military cooperation were discussed. However, the key thesis sounded unequivocal. There can be no seizure of territory and no forceful revision of sovereignty. Moreover, these words were backed not only by diplomacy, but also by concrete signals of force. According to insiders, Trump was directly informed that in the event of an attempt at a force-based scenario, Europe was preparing for large-scale military exercises and the transfer of tens of thousands of troops in the northern direction, which would be an unprecedented step in the entire history of relations between allies. The message was extremely tough. If the US decides on Greenland, it will have to deal not with a single country, but with a consolidated Western world. It was precisely after this, sources claim, that Trump's closest advisors insisted on a change of tactics, convincing him that further escalation would lead not to a strengthening of American positions, but to a direct conflict with allies, the consequences of which would be catastrophic both politically and economically. As a result, the White House chose a pause and a transition to negotiations, leaving the details of the future deal behind closed doors. The question of the exact terms on which a compromise will be reached remains open. However, it is already possible to speak about the main result. Europe has for the first time in a long while demonstrated readiness to defend its sovereignty not only with words, but with concrete actions. Even the temporary refusal of the US to impose tariffs and pursue a force-based scenario became an indicator that a tough and unified position is capable of changing the balance. And although the crisis around Greenland is still far from final resolution, this episode can already be seen as the moment when Europe managed to defend its key interests and make it clear that the era of unilateral diktat within the Western world is coming to an end. At the same time, as sources in European delegations emphasize, the pause taken by Donald Trump does not at all mean the final closure of the issue, but rather indicates the transition of the conflict into a more complex and less public phase. In the corridors of Davos, the wording "frozen escalation" is increasingly heard, in which the sides temporarily step back from direct pressure but continue bargaining over the terms of the future balance. European negotiators, according to insiders, proceeded from a simple calculation. If hard limits of what is acceptable are not set now, then in the future any agreements will turn out to be empty. That is precisely why the position on Greenland was formulated as unambiguously as possible and without room for ambiguous interpretations. In European capitals, it is emphasized that concessions on issues of US military presence within NATO are the price for preserving the former security architecture, but not an indulgence for revising borders. Such an approach, analysts believe, came as a surprise to the American side, accustomed to the fact that allies ultimately agree with Washington's line after a period of pressure. This time, the scenario did not work. According to sources, it was precisely the demonstration of Europe's readiness to move from diplomacy to concrete military preparations that became the decisive factor that changed the White House's calculations. Trump's advisors, analyzing the possible consequences, concluded that an open conflict with Europe would trigger a chain reaction, from an economic blow to American corporations to a strategic weakening of the US amid the strengthening of China and other centers of power. In this context, the outcasts from Tariffs and the temporary de-escalation around Greenland look not like a concession, but like a forced recognition of new realities. European sources emphasize that this episode became an important psychological turning point. For the first time in a long while, the US faced a situation in which pressure on allies not only failed to produce results, but also provoked their consolidation. Attention is now focused on the details of a future deal, which apparently will concern a redistribution of roles within NATO, an expansion of the American military presence in Europe, and possibly new forms of coordination in the Arctic without changes to sovereignty. However, even if a compromise is found, the consequences of the crisis can no longer be fully reversed. In European analytical circles, it is emphasized that trust, once called into question, is restored slowly and never returns to its previous form. That is why the current situation is seen as the beginning of a more mature and tougher stage in relations between Europe and the US, where automatic loyalty no longer exists. For Europe, this crisis became proof that sovereignty must be backed not only by treaties, but by real readiness to act. For the US, it is a signal that the era of unconditional leadership within the Western world is coming to an end. And although formally the conflict around Greenland has been temporarily removed from the agenda, it has already changed strategic thinking on both sides of the Atlantic, marking the boundaries beyond which compromises turn into an existential choice. In this new context, European leaders are increasingly speaking about the need to entrench the achieved effect institutionally, so that similar crises are no longer resolved in emergency mode. According to sources, Brussels is discussing the creation of permanent coordination mechanisms on the Arctic that would allow Europe to act as a single actor rather than responding in a fragmented way to external initiatives. At the same time, work is intensifying on scenarios of economic resilience in case of renewed escalation, ranging from backup trade agreements to accelerated diversification of supply chains. The American side, as insiders note, is carefully registering these signals, understanding that each such decision reduces the space for pressure in the future. As a result, the pause taken now increasingly looks not like a temporary breather, but like the beginning of a long revision of the rules of the game, where both sides are forced to take into account a new reality. An alliance rests not on ultimatums, but on mutually recognized boundaries of what is acceptable. And it is precisely this conclusion, according to analysts, that will become the main legacy of the current crisis. Even if formally it ends in a compromise, the strategic thinking of Europe and the US has already changed forever. In this sense, the Greenland episode turned out to be not so much an isolated incident as a rehearsal for future conflicts within the Western Bloc. It showed that the previous model, in which strategic decisions were made unilaterally, no longer works without resistance and costs. Now, any attempts at pressure inevitably trigger counterprocesses, consolidation, preparation of alternative scenarios, and a reassessment of alliance commitments. For Europe, this crisis became a moment of recognizing its own agency. It turned out that a firm, pre-coordinated position is capable not only of stopping escalation, but also of changing the behavior of a stronger partner. For the United States, it was a signal that room for maneuver within the alliance has narrowed, and that every new initiative will be viewed through the prism of trust that has already been undermined once. That is why, analysts believe, in the coming years, we will see not a return to the previous status quo, but the gradual formation of a new architecture of relations, more complex, less emotional, and far more pragmatic.